Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are live on August 8th. Today's webinar is going to be Fundamentals of Developing a Tribal Nonprofit Part 2. Today's webinar will be presented by Vince Franco, and we are being recorded. My name is Alyssa Atkins, and I am the Training and Development Coordinator for the Native Learning Center, and today I will be your webinar facilitator. Just a quick disclaimer before we get to start. Oh my gosh. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. If you look at the top of your screen, you will see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or just a hand. With that icon, you can either raise hand, agree, disagree, or step away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. To the bottom left, you will see a box that says Files. Here you will find today's presentation and additional handouts. Please feel free to download a copy for yourself. Simply click the item you would like to download, then click the arrow pointing downwards to download and save onto your device. Once the item is downloaded, it should appear in your device's download section. The second box that states web links, this box is where you will find all the links attached to today's webinar, as well as any additionals. Lastly, to the right of the screen, we have a chat box available. This is how you will communicate to the instructor and NLC staff. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to interact by using the chat box. Simply type your message and hit enter or click that up arrow icon button to submit. We encourage class participation, so please feel free to write in those questions or comments. Tech support issues should also be submitted here. And with that being said, I will now like to introduce Vince Franco.
All right. Hey, thank you, Wista, and welcome everyone. Welcome back. If this is your return trip from session 1 last week, and those of you that might be new, welcome. We are, as Wista had mentioned, we are in part 2 of effective structure. Part 2 of a 4-part series. We're going through this methodically. If you were with me last week, we spent a solid 90 minutes discussing the part 1 issues, the basic startup issues. I covered a lot of things there. I put up some information on resources, and then I get into a lengthy description about the purpose of becoming a nonprofit. And I talked about the vision and the mission, making sure that you know what you're doing, because it's a little bit of a road, a path, a journey to get to the nonprofit. I know a lot of folks are interested in getting to the nonprofit as quickly as possible, but it is a journey getting there. There's a lot of moving parts, and that's what this is all about. I could consolidate this into an hour and a half, a single webinar, but I don't think I'd be doing anybody any justice by doing that. There's some things that have to occur, and if you were with me last week, you know that we talked about not just the vision and the mission. We got into such things as thinking through and going through the process of registering your name with the state, whatever state you might be in. I see 305 is represented here. I'm just a little bit north of that in 561. We're talking area code language there. But for those that are representing 305, you can go to sunbiz.org, myflorida.com/sunbiz. If you're at all interested, that is the quick path to get to where you need to go with this in the state of Florida. But I talked about that for those of you that are representing other states, the Department of State. Sometimes they go by different names, but it's basically every state government has what's referred to as a Department of State or something like that, something similar to that. That's where you go. And I talked about registering your name. And then I also came out of there, we talked about the employer identification number, known as the EIN number, which you do with the IRS. There's no cost for that. It's a simple online process, and I recommended doing both in our journey to go to apply for nonprofit status. Registering the state might cost you a little bit of money, but I went through the parameters and the dynamics of doing that, if you recall, and then got into articles of incorporation, which is done at the state level as well. There's a fee for that. Once you complete that articles of incorporation, as you might recall, and get the notification from the state, you are incorporated. You are a recognized entity in the state of whatever you're doing, wherever you're going to be doing business. You're not a nonprofit yet, but you're kind of getting your ducks in a row, and that's where we're going to go now, is kind of move inside the organizations for a little bit. Today, I'm going to be talking about effective structure, and what I mean by that is internal operation. A little bit about that. I'm going to talk about 4 different things in particular. One is the difference between operation and governance. I'll get into that in a minute. I just touched on it a little bit last week, but I want to talk about that a little bit more. And then building effectiveness, function versus dysfunction, and productive meetings. That's going to be the second issue. Third, organizational traits. Things that make a corporation, let alone a nonprofit, run more effectively. And that's what, ultimately that's what we're trying to do, right? Not only just set it up, but set ourselves up for success. And then the last thing is leadership characteristics, the type of personality traits that are common in successful nonprofits. So what we're going to be doing here is looking kind of internally to make sure we've got everything set up with our leadership and our internal functions, because obviously that's going to follow with us as we move through this journey to become a nonprofit. And it's one of the questions, or a series of questions actually, that the IRS is going to have for us. And sorry, my screen just went blank for a second. Bear with me. There we go. I'm back. These are questions that are going to come up from the IRS in one way or another, a series of questions, not just one, but a series of questions on the internal structure. And I'm talking about here what's referred to as a board of directors or board of commissioners. I use both of those interchangeably, but I'm gonna kind of lean towards the board of directors as the phrase I want to use, the leadership. Every organization, every corporation, let alone every nonprofit, is required to have a board of directors. So it makes sense to get that structure set up early in your journey. Now, as I mentioned, we went through the application process last week, talked about that, the incorporation process, which is another stepping stone to move us closer to nonprofit status. You've got a registered name, hopefully. We're thinking about it. You've done your EIN number. You've filed articles of incorporation or used the template at the state. Doesn't have to be complicated. You've got acknowledgement back from the state that you are indeed incorporated. Pat yourself on the back. That's a big step if you've already accomplished that. That's major. We also talked about bylaws and that kind of structure and insurance last week, as you recall. So now let's move on and start looking internally a little bit and talk about happy trigger finger here. Okay, this is what I was just talking about. Top left, part 1, what we did last week. Bottom left, today's discussion that I just went through. Top right, part 3. That's next week. Part 3. Start looking more for funding for the organization. So big transition there. But we've got to have a discussion about the role of the board of directors, what they are, before we even get into discussions about fundraising and grants and all that, because the board, your leadership, plays a huge part in that. And again, the IRS in its questions to you about your want-to-be IRS operation and structure are going to ask you questions about fundraising, let alone questions about your board structure. So all of these are in place as stepping stones to move us in the right direction. So next week, funding. And then finally, part 4 is the actual process of applying for the actual determination of a 501c3 charitable organization. That's the ultimate goal. Part 4. That's 2 weeks from now. So we're kind of working our way towards that. And I just want to say before we go any further, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box. The best way to get a comment or to get a question to me or to the NLC staff is to put something in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on it. I try to. I have it right up here on my screen. So you put something in, it pops up immediately. I can see it. If I miss it by chance, bear with us. I'm sure the NLC staff will step in and let me know. I like to deal with questions and concerns as they arise. I don't like waiting to the end of the presentation for lots of various reasons. We like to, deal with these questions and concerns that you may or may not have immediately. All right, so let's keep going. This was something that was actually from the first part. I'll go through it quickly. This is a carryover from part 1 from yesterday. Should an organization that wants to incorporate on its mission to become a nonprofit, that's step 1, add the tag company to their name, and your options are: sure, you will not have a problem at all with your state name registration process. That's A. B. Absolutely. After all, we are a company and not an organization. C. No way. We are certain to have an issue with the state registration process and recognition as well. D, A, and B, or E, all of the above. Think on that for a second and let you know. Whoop, jumped right over that. It's C. You're going to have a problem. You can't use the word company. If you want to be a nonprofit, you can't call yourself a company. The state won't let you do that. So get that out of your mind. If you're thinking you want to call yourself ABC company, you can't do that and become a nonprofit. That's the whole reason of incorporation. Well, one of the reasons of incorporating, and you'd have to use that term incorporation, not company, incorporation, or its abbreviation, Inc. Like my organization is, incorporated. So it's got an Inc. at the end of its name. So, and that's going to be a requirement across the board at all state levels. So the first thing I want to talk about internally with operation and structure of your leadership of your organization is the difference between operating and governance. Now, you're new, or I assume that you're new and you're moving towards becoming a nonprofit, or if you are, you're in the right place. If you already are a nonprofit, then you might be experiencing this. As you move towards that process, and even once you achieve nonprofit status, you're going to be small, you're going to be new, and your board of directors, you got to remember, you got to have at least 3, no matter what state you're in. They're going to be doing everything initially, most likely, to start with. That's called operating, more hands-on, as opposed to governance. Let me go to the next slide here, gently. All right, operating versus governance. At some point, the board of directors, your leadership, will at some point need to transition. And this, I'm putting this here because this is a potential area of dysfunction as the organization grows. We've got to make sure, and it makes perfect sense, that board of directors, including yourself, if you're one of them, are going to be involved in day-to-day activities. That's an operation. That's operational. It's to be expected as a new nonprofit, a new incorporation, a new nonprofit comes on board and ramps up, starts out. That's going to happen. But at some point, hopefully down the road, once you become more mature, once the organization starts functioning, starts perhaps even getting to the point where they might be able to receive revenue coming in, there's going to be a point where you will bring on staff, whether it's part-time or full-time. And this is where, or even volunteers to do the day-to-day. And this is where boards need to keep this in mind, that they need to transition out of operational and more towards governance. That every organization is going to be different of when this occurs, but it has to be in the thought process. You don't want, at some point, you want to make sure that you're not micromanaging the organization. This is the whole idea of bringing staff on board. Now, if your plans are not to bring in any staff at all or any volunteers to do the day-to-day work, then this is a moot issue. But most organizations have at least volunteers or part-time employees coming on as they mature and as they receive more and more potential for revenue streams. And this is where the growth and this is where the separation happens. It's a trend. Okay, next slide. See, it wants to jump two at a time, and I don't want it to do that. Here we go. Make sure I didn't miss anything there. Okay. Building effectiveness, function versus dysfunction. And that, what I was just talking about, the difference between operational and governance falls into this, or can fall into the difference between a functional organization and a dysfunctional. In fact, it's one of the major areas that nonprofits have issues with productivity, and that is not being able to transition themselves, their staff, their board from the governance to the from the operational to the governance. This needs to be something. I'm just going to stop here before I get into examples of function and dysfunction. One of the things that works for a lot of nonprofits, and this is something to think about as you're moving forward with this, is to have two things. One is to have some kind of orientation or onboarding for board members, working on that now, so that you have things ready. One of those things would be having a job description, literally having a job description. We're going to see one in a minute. It's not real fancy, but I have what would be the equivalent of a job description for board members. So start there, job description for board members, orientation or onboarding for new board members, not just now during your startup phase, but ongoing. Because I would imagine as you move on and as you mature, you're going to be bringing on more board of director members, more leadership. Some people will come off, new ones will come on, and you need to define those parameters of how you do that. Onboarding, orientation, and continuing education play a huge part of that, like for any business, right? All businesses need to have onboarding, continuing education, internal controls, policies and procedures. You're no different. You will be no different. In fact, the IRS is going to be looking for you to be able to describe your structure, let alone a lot of other things like fundraising and all that, once you apply for that 501c3. So put this on your list of things to be aware of. And that, let's move into this actual description or a function, the difference between functional and effective boards have to work at it, like every organization. Holding regular meetings. Even though you're right there, holding regular meetings, to stop there for a second, even though you're not yet a nonprofit organization, that's the whole purpose of this training, is to get you to that point where you can apply. There's nothing wrong with, after your incorporation, after your identification of board members, to hold a meeting, a board of directors meeting right early on. And I may have mentioned this last week, some of the things that you want to do in that first board meeting, whenever it happens, is to approve everything that's occurred prior to that. In other words, the selection of your name and the registration process, the articles of incorporation process, and the articles that were received from the state, the bylaws that you submitted or developed, the insurance, all of those things that transpired prior to your actual, prior to the meeting, you want to incorporate into a meeting and approve them as some of the first acts. And then from that point on, have regular meetings and do this on a regular basis, because you're going to continue to do things and file, the EIN number. You want to approve that too. All of these things need to be approved, your insurance, all of that. And then you want to document that. And then, as it says on that first line there in the light blue, regular meetings from that point on. Even though you're not a nonprofit yet, you're incorporated as a business. So this is what businesses do, especially if they want to move towards nonprofit. They bring their board of directors together and they have formal meetings. I used a small f in formal. They don't have to be, structured with hardcore parliamentary procedure, but you do need to have some kind of documented meeting with minutes recording that approval was held, approval was attained for all of these important procedures and functions that happened prior to the meeting, if you follow me. Okay. Organization and mission are understood. That's another thing that needs to be approved. Your organization, your mission, your name, as I mentioned. There also needs to be trust between board members and board and potential staff. And even if we're talking volunteers at the beginning that are helping on a part-time basis, there needs to be communication. I guess I cannot stress that enough. Guidelines are established in practice. There's nothing wrong. In fact, if you're going to be, let's look ahead just real quick. If you're going to be receiving at some point or want to be receiving funds, perhaps federal grants or any types of donations, you need to have internal controls. You need to have policies and procedures. So it's not too soon to start thinking about that with your board to put together at least fundamental procedural items in your bylaws now. You can always change them as things get more sophisticated. And what do I mean by that? Well, you're probably going to, for example, start on a cash basis. If you receive any monies, even though you're not a nonprofit, you might get some funds. There are no tax deductions with it because you're not a 501c3, but yet you might be able to accumulate assets or cash or something, land or some other items. And you'll probably be working on a cash basis to start with, but as you get more sophisticated and get into accounts receivables, incomes payables, then you might move from a cash system to an accrual system, which is the more accepted accounting practice, but not necessarily from the start. You were too small for that. And quite frankly, you want to start small, managed growth, as we like to call it. You want to start small so that you meet the IRS classifications. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks, about thresholds, monetary thresholds and asset value thresholds that make you more of a candidate for the short form, for the abbreviated process to become a nonprofit. More on that in 2 weeks. Well, I'll allude to it in more next week when we talk fundraising, and then we'll really analyze it on 4 out of 4, the fourth session. Okay, accountability is maintained from the get-go. Transparency, accountability, internal controls as much as you can with your bylaws, your policies and procedures from the very beginning. As much as you can. You can't think of everything, of course, but as much internal controls, as much accountability and transparency as you can put forward and describe. That's going to pay off for you in the long run. IRS, again, is going to be looking for your interpretation of these things. And if they don't like it, they're going to ask you to put it in writing, which you should do anyway. And it could be a make or break situation with that, depending if you're antiquated or you've got nothing. So that, again, is part of the reason why we're doing this methodical approach to nonprofit startup. Okay. Strategic planning process. Don't freak out by the term strategic planning. It sounds like a huge task. It's not. It's really being able to take objectives and goals with their outcomes and results and projecting them into subsequent periods of time. More on that when we get into fundraising next week. And the last one there, obviously, you've got to think about, and board of director members are responsible for revenue generation, traditional as in cash and non-traditional. And you need to start thinking about it now, how you're going to solicit your revenue streams or structure your revenue streams, how you're going to create fundraising. That's the term the IRS uses, so I'm going to use it here. Fundraising plan. You got to start thinking about it now. How are you going to maintain sustainability moving forward? You're going to have to explain that to the IRS during your application process. Let them know that you are aware of it, and you are working on ways to sustain the organization. More on functional effective. Meetings have a focus, financials, not right off the bat, but as you start and as you're going to have potential expenses, you're going to have to find a way to generate some kind of even more, the most primitive of a financial statement, right? To have that to show potential budget, potential revenues, open communication, as I mentioned. Little turnover is more geared towards more mature nonprofits, but of course we want to try to minimize turnover even at a board level. Evaluations are conducted. Well, if you're going to have a job description for every position, including boards, then you should have some kind of evaluation process of productivity included in that as well. All right, it could be very minimal at first, but then as you attain nonprofit status and you grow as a nonprofit organization, that becomes more and more critical as daily operation, right? All right, so if you have committees, that's second to the bottom there. As I mentioned during the bylaws, even though you have no plans to hire people right now, even if you have no plans to have committees right now, it's okay to include those possibilities in your bylaws, that at some point you might have a committee, or let's call it something different, an ad hoc group or an advisory group. So that word committees is an open-ended, it means a lot of different things. So I think you need to set yourself up in your bylaws to say something to the effect of, we will develop and implement committees or ad hoc groups or advisory councils or other types of input from the community at large on an as-needed basis. And I would approach employees the same way. Employees, whether part-time, full-time, voluntary, or for pay, will be brought on at the board's discretion on an as-needed basis. That kind of approach. And that way, it's included, at least in a general sense, in your bylaws, both of those things, employees and committees. So even though you have no plans right now, perhaps because you're small and bringing on staff and having a committee structure is something that's only reserved for large nonprofits. No, not, and I wouldn't limit the bylaws because down the road, if you think about it, you don't want to be changing your bylaws frequently. So these kind of things you need to think about, and to the best of your ability, incorporate them into, your bylaws, along with the very bottom thing there. We talked about onboarding, orientation, continuing education, job descriptions. Code of conduct is one of those very important things. Conflict of interest. You want to have those kind of things up front for your board members that also can carry over to staff when they come on board. Code of conduct. How does a person, whether they're a board of director member or a staff member of my want-to-be nonprofit, what are my expectations of them of being a good employee, and what are the penalties of not being that kind of a person, whether they're a board member or not. Board members can go rogue just as much as a paid staff person can go rogue. So you want to make sure at all times that you are protecting the program, protecting the organization. Code of conduct, conflict of interest, job descriptions, evaluations, all those things I've been talking about of internal controls are for your own benefit. It behooves you to have stuff like this, or think through it, talk about it, so that you can incorporate it one way or another into your program. So moving on, dysfunctional would be just the opposite of everything I was talking about. No meetings, no organization or structures understood. That's where communication plays a great part. Governance principles are not applied. Lack of trust, that can tear down an organization. Lack of trust between board member to board member to staff, et cetera, et cetera. That one, public speaking, you might not be aware of that. Let me just hover there for a minute and talk about my experience with public speaking without permission. You got to keep in mind that a board of directors, according to the state, according to parliamentary procedures, A nonprofit's board of directors, any board of directors, is a governing body. If it were a tribal entity, it would have sovereign immunity. It would be the voice of the organization. It's considered a body. And you've got to be careful as you move forward and think through this, who speaks on behalf of the organization, of the body. This is another thing that probably should be incorporated into your meetings as board members and into your bylaws. Who has the authority to speak on behalf of the body, of the organization, of the nonprofit? And furthermore, who has the authority to sign off on legal documents, whether they be loans, maybe they grants, lease for property, anything that's a legal doc? Who has that authority to speak on behalf or to take action on behalf of the organization? And everyone else who does not have that authority needs to mute themselves, so to speak. We've got to be careful who speaks. So we have, for any organization, let alone nonprofits, one voice, one consistent message all the time, especially in a crisis situation. I hope to God you don't have that. But we want to make sure that our message is consistent and the voice that is coming from the body is consistent and approved, right? Got to be approved. That's what I mean, public speaking without permission. Who represents your organization? At the very beginning, probably all of your board members do, right? All of them do. But there needs to be parameters of how information is gathered, how information about the organization is disseminated, whether it's in writing or verbally. You know what I mean? You've got to be careful of this because you've got to represent yourself, your organization, as a legitimate body. You're incorporated, or should be, and you're on your way to becoming a nonprofit, and you're going to have federal control, federal entities looking at you. I don't mean to scare anybody, but whether it's your structure from the beginning or subsequent reports that have to be generated, let alone grant funding with all of its strings attached to it. So you can't be too overprotective or over methodical in this process. That's why I'm putting these things out there to think about. And you can decide the importance of them. They're all important to me, but you can decide the priority of the importance. I talked about micromanagement. I talked about the kind of the kiss of death that staff or volunteers are ignored. We don't ignore anyone. That's a great way to lose a volunteer that's probably worth their weight in gold, or could be, is to ignore their services. We don't ever want to do that, whether they're a board member or a bookkeeper, right? Dysfunctional, more. Nothing happens during meetings. Mission is not clear. We talked about the mission and how critical that is. Financials are missing. As you move along, we become bigger and bigger. That becomes more of an issue. Disrespect among members. Meetings are dominated by a few. That's why we'll talk a little bit about parliamentary procedure and the adoption of that process. Your internal bylaw should reflect that you're adopting a parliamentary procedure or a modified version of it, and it needs to be enforced from the beginning. From the very get-go, first meeting, you adopt it. You're adopting parliamentary procedure is your operational structure for meetings. It doesn't have to be Robert's Rules of Order structure, which is very, very, very structured, but it could be a modified version. That's a whole discussion in itself, parliamentary procedures. We can have that. If you have questions on that, send me a text, send me an email, put some in the chat box, let Louisa or Brooke know, and then we'll have an offline conversation about it, or maybe even training about it. We can do that too. All right. But it's critical that we have these things put in place. Just some more information here on effectiveness for meetings. You can look through it. I touched on all these. Make members responsible for governance issues. Review articles of incorporation and bylaws. Not so much articles. Articles are kind of like, Moses standing. Those are like the 10 Commandments. You're not going to change those, hopefully. But your bylaws are much more flexible and easy to change. So keep that in mind. Written documentation and defining roles and responsibilities from the beginning. Come on, it's jumping over. There we go. Define what the organization is looking for, and basically this is the job description thing I was talking about, even for board members. And I also mentioned parliamentary procedures. Keep in mind that parliamentary procedure, in particular Robert's Rules of Order, defines the roles of board members. It tells you what a chairman's responsibilities are according to parliamentary procedure, what a vice chair, secretary, and treasurer, what those responsibilities are. We can use that, or you can define your own versions, descriptions. Review who is in comparison to what you're looking for. 7 talks about considering established term limits for boards. Maybe not an issue right, at the beginning, but down the road, you've got to structure the organization so leadership can roll off and new blood can come on. We're always looking for new people to come on board, right? We want to grow our board. We want to have some kind of a farm system established so we know how to identify potential board members and bring them through the ranks, so to speak, so that they know what they're doing when they come on board. Initially, right now for this training, I'm assuming that a lot of people are new to this and we don't have the training in place yet. But we want to, position ourselves to be able to do that down the road as the organization hopefully grows, as you receive nonprofit classification and you move on. Keep members engaged at all levels, not just members, but board members, committee, volunteers. If you have them, keep committees meaningful. Use them where you need them. Don't just create them because you've got them included in your bylaws. You have it hopefully mentioned in your bylaws so that it's a streamlined process when you need to create an ad hoc committee or an advisory group, and you've got the permission to do so at a board level. Orientation. I talked about an orientation, continuing education for everybody. And I'll tell you what, down the road as a nonprofit, if you're interested in receiving federal funding, you need to it has to be documented that you have continuing education in place for everyone involved in your organization. That means your board and that means your staff. So you've got to have it, especially if you're going down the road at some point for federal funding. Okay, responsibilities and duties. Let's go through this really quick. Make sure I didn't miss. See? Okay. Selecting a chief executive. Somewhere down the road, you're going to have to set yourself up. The nonprofit needs to set itself up for success at some point, hopefully, optimistically, as the organization grows and potential for revenue is there, or soon to be, that you bring on a staff person to handle the responsibilities. One of the responsibilities of the board is the selection of that person, whether it's volunteer, whether it's part-time or full-time. And this is when we get to this point where a nonprofit gets to this point where they're selecting staff, let alone a chief executive, we are moving, aren't we? We are transitioning from a operational board to more of a governance board, right? That's our first clue that we need to make some step. If you're going to bring on a staff person to handle day-to-day responsibilities, whether it's bookkeeping or general operation or several people, then that is hands off. That's a separation of church and state. Now we're separating the duties. We're moving more towards governance as a board, right? Creating internal controls, creating policies and procedures, making decisions for the organization, for the body, and we leave the executive or the staff person to do their job, do the responsibilities, and we don't get into micromanagement. We're separation of duties. That even follows generally accepted accounting practices, GAAP practices, right? Separation of duties. All right, same concept here. Supporting the chief executive, all too important, but there's much, much more. Right? Supporting financial literacy. What it's saying here is you need to have an idea how the organization's financial structure needs to be set up initially, and also how it's going to work with revenues, receivables and payables, and revenue generation and bills that it has to pay. You need everyone involved at a board level, and hopefully the chief staff person understands the financial literacy needed to be able to run a nonprofit organization. They don't need to be a CPA. They don't need to be a financial planner. They don't need to be an auditor, but they need to have a certain amount of financial literacy to understand, especially if you're going to send them out to do fundraising for the organization, and they're going to have to talk dollars and cents and donations to corporate entities, and private individuals are going to have to understand the dynamics of the financial structure and be able to relay that back to whomever is a potential donor. Providing, and it goes to say, not only that, but provide the financial oversight, the overview of the organization. Board members are responsible. It is not the staff person's responsibility, although they may have day-to-day activities. It is the board's responsibility. Everything in this case trickles up. You've heard of trickling down effect, trickle down economics from the 80s under the Reagan administration, where they coined that phrase, trickle down economics. No, we're talking about trickle up. We're talking about the board being the ultimate decision maker here. So everything moves up. So providing proper financial oversight is critical, as if the organization is going to grow and as the organization grows. Those are critically important things. Ensuring adequate resources. We'll talk a lot about that next week when I get into fundraising, right? Revenue generation, creating revenue streams. Board of directors are responsible for creating them and actually, to some extent, doing them. Every board member, I preach this to board members too. Every board member has, part of their responsibility of a board member is to play a part in the role of fundraising, whether it's going out and asking for donations or being involved one way or another. All board members, basically everyone involved in the nonprofit, has to be involved in fundraising, or you're not going to have an organization. It won't last very long. So this is critical. And not only fundraising, but resources. That this is a broader term. We're talking about more than just cash flow. Here we're talking about locating, identifying, interpreting, and bringing in resources to the organization as it grows, to help it grow, not as it grows. That'll make it grow. Okay, ensuring happy trigger finger again. Did I skip one? Okay, we talked about that. There we go. Ensuring legal and ethical integrity and maintaining accountability. Well, we talked about the accountability. We talked a little bit about the ethical, code of conduct, and we have some legal obligations to talk about too, which we'll get into. But we talked about in the blue shades down there, accounting practices, management practices, personal integrity a little bit, truth in selling. Well, that's down the road. Truth in selling products and services. Hopefully you get to that point as a nonprofit that you can sell a product or service and generate revenue in that. And of course you have to be aware of truth and, all those truth in selling and all those kind of things. All right. Keeping an eye on that chat box too. Ensuring effective organizational planning, just like ensuring resources. Also, the board's responsibility is making sure that the organization is structured properly for growth. Hard to do at first, right? Because you might be very, very tiny. It's all hands on, but you have to think this through, that as you grow, there's going to be organizational structure pressure. The burden is on the board to try to figure out how to structure and to make sure that you have bringing in the resources, whether it's staff or other types of resources to grow, basically. Even a tribal environment, same thing. Okay, recruiting. We talked about recruiting-oriented, retaining members. We talked about that quite a bit so far. There we go. Talked about the orientation. There's a nice little QR code there if you're interested. In fact, now that I have it up on the screen, I want to make sure it works. I'm going to bring my phone up to it. and the camera. Make sure it takes you to Board Orientation 101, just as it says. It's a nice read. Additional information. Other than just listening to me, there are other people saying the same thing. And that's a nice little story, a quick read on board orientation and the critical role that it plays. Not just orientation, but continuing education. Okay. Determining, monitoring, strengthening the organization's program. That's a board role. Not, that's what you're supposed to do. The board plays a critical role in influencing the organization's processes, and function. So let's see what that says. Warning: recent challenges for most organizations include the risk of cyber attacks becoming more and more prevalent, right? Related to social media, identity theft, things like that. Cloud computing, storage, IT implementation, technology, and the protection of personally identifiable information. That PII, personally identifiable information, is becoming more and more critical as we start looking at, if you were receiving federal funds, I would say, like federal grants, I would say you're going to have internal controls that protect personal information: name, social security number, date of birth, marital status, bank account. Just all of those are personally identifiable information, along more recently with biometrics. Eye scans, fingerprints, retina scans, facial recognition. All of those things are becoming more and more prevalent, right, in what we do. Just go to the airport and, you've got TSA, you've got the CLEAR system there, which is a biometric scanning system, facial recognition, retinal recognition, all that kind of stuff. So that falls also into personally identifiable information and the protection of that. Something we need to consider. But that's down the road. That's down the road. If you are receiving federal funds, I would say be very, very careful here. Let's talk about having internal controls in place that provide limited access, and talk about the security of that information, both electronically and in hard copy. But that's a discussion for down the road. It's a good thing to keep in mind. Security of information should always be on the board's agenda. Security of buildings, security of staff, security of self, security of information, whether it's hard copy, whether it's intellectual property, all of those things need to have mechanisms in place for protection. And very delicate. All right, let's jump over that and go to potential job description. Now, according to parliamentary procedures, here's the foundation of 4 or 5 positions within your leadership, board of directors for a potential nonprofit. According to Robert's Rules of Order, according to parliamentary procedure, the chairperson of the board attends and oversees the board meetings, may act as a spokesperson for the organization. That is assumed through parliamentary procedure, and works in partnership with the chief executive, if there is one, of the organization. Then it goes on to talk about a vice chair, if you have one, attends and oversees the board meetings in the absence of the chairperson. Keep in mind, this is parliamentary procedure, right? Can you imagine sitting around the table? This is what parliamentary would dictate, that the vice chair acts in the absence of the chairperson to make decisions or to run a meeting or to do whatever, may act as an alternative spokesperson for the organization according to parliamentary procedure, works in partnership with the chair, and performs other assigned duties that the chair, who technically, according to parliamentary procedure, represents the body, the board of directors as a body. All right, then they have definitions of secretary and treasurer. The secretary attends all board meetings and maintains all board records, maintains your accuracy, and then you can see treasurer. Not all small want to be incorporated, don't want to be nonprofits have all these positions, but as you progress, you want to avoid, in fact, I would not use the word president or vice president. Those are terms that are used for the for-profit organizations. Typically, on the nonprofit side, we see this: chairperson, vice chair, secretary, treasurer, and then there's all kinds of other class. You can have members at large, which means you have 7 board members. 4 of them are officers, chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer, and the other 3 are non-officers, but they're board members. So they would be referred commonly in parliamentary procedure as members at large. They have a vote, they have a say, but they're not an officer. And then you can add on all kinds of things beyond this, such as an ex officio, which is technically, according to parliamentary procedure, is the chairperson removed. They've served their term and they've rotated off of being an officer. They're more of a member at large again, but because of their duty as an officer, they get the title of ex officio. If you want to do that, you can put it in your bylaws. Nothing else changes. They still have a vote. They can still do with all what a member at large can do. They just have that wonderful title. So you can do things like that, or you can streamline it, but you need to move in that direction. So let's talk about let's move into legal obligations. We are coming close to the top of the hour, so I want to go through legal obligations and then characteristics, and then we'll be done. So we've got 3 important legal obligations that board members need to be aware of and need to incorporate into their bylaws. The board does into bylaws for board members and into internal controls. And you need to be aware of this. The first one that's common, you can look this stuff up if you wish to. I'm not making these things up. There's 3 of them in particular. Duty of care is the first one. It requires board members to exercise due diligence and attention to the substantive matters brought before the board. I mean, that's also in our code of conduct, right? And our conflict of interest. We're there to focus on issues of the board which pertain to the incorporation or nonprofit. It means attending meetings, asking questions, challenging assumptions, and conducting formal business. That's the definition of duty of care, and that's one of the main legal obligations that board members have. The second one, there's a little bit more on duty of care. It means that board members must give the same care and concern to their responsibilities as any prudent or ordinary person would. This means board members should be actively participating in meetings on a regular basis and any other committees, ad hoc, advisory, as they are used and as the organization grows. Duty of care also means members have the responsibility for financial and operational oversight of services and events, especially fundraising functions. The rest of this is fundraising, donations, grants, government support, earnings from product sales. That's all fundraising. So financial oversight also includes making sure that members of the organization use use all assets prudently and responsibly. Okay, duty of care breach is the failure to live up to the required standard of care. So to breach something, you need to understand what duty of care is. It should be in the bylaws. It should be defined. That's the typical definition that I showed you. You can massage that as you wish, but basically duty of care is pretty straightforward. And, you also want to have this to protect the organization. Not that anyone would do anything wrong, but down the road, people are creatures of habit and they do strange things sometimes. You want to have this as a management tool so that you can keep the program protected and you can, how do you put this nicely, move people out of their positions as, as with having means to do so. Again, to protect the program. And this is a way to protect the program. Along with the next one here, duty of loyalty, which is one of the 2 primary. You just saw the first one. There's really 3, but primary fiduciary responsibilities, which means financial, good stewarding of monies, Required of members, others being the duty of care. It recognized pursuit of the organization's best interest at all times and avoidance of conflict of interest. So again, this should be something incorporated into your bylaws, probably something into your code of conduct as well as you mature, as you move along for your board members now, and as you bring on more board members down the road, and especially staff as well. They fall under this as well. Not so much, well, duty of loyalty is expected. Do the job for, protect the program, work for the organization. This is geared more towards board members. But the last one, conflict of interest, we talked about conflict, a conflict of interest in a transaction or arrangement that benefits the board member on a personal memo. So you want to avoid those. You want to spell those out in your bylaws. You want to have those incorporated into your orientation and even into your continuing organization. So you're reminding your board members and your staff about their obligations. A couple of QR codes here bringing you to different sites, both related to code of conduct. Microsoft Word, Final Simple Tribal Code of Judicial Conduct on the left there, and then another one for tribal housing, TDHEs from HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development. There's another one there, links to both of those sources, information on code of conduct. So, I would encourage you to, at your leisure, look that information over. Wow, come on. Okay, we talked about obedience. Last one. Requires that the organization obeys applicable laws, regulations, acts in accordance with ethical practices, and statutory rules, commonly accepted accounting principles, regulations that come down from federal funders for federal awards, et cetera, that the organization adheres to its stated purpose, which is basically its mission statement, and that its activities advance the mission. Always. Everything that you do is for the good of the program. Everything that you do should enhance the mission. If it doesn't enhance the mission of the organization, then it should not be incorporated into as a practice or as a fundraising or as a product or service, right? Everything back to the mission of the organization. All right, cool. Characteristics. We'll finish up here talking about, the kind of personality traits that we want to see in our leadership. And everyone basically associated with the organization, but of particular interest to board of director members. That's where we're focusing. But before I get into this, I just want to stop and make sure you don't have any questions or concerns so far. Let me know if you do have any questions or concerns on anything we've been talking about. Hopefully it makes sense to you, helping you if this is new to you. I'm not trying to overwhelm you if this is new, but these are some of the things we need to talk about, and that's the reason why we spread this out over a month, is to give you time to think about all these processes that need to take place, like we talked about in the first session, and all the other internal structure, like we're talking about today, that needs to be put in place, and operational things that need to be considered, before you move on to the next step, which is structure. I don't want to use that word again. Orchestrated attempts at fundraising processes. And fundraising is a very broad term for generating or setting yourself up for success financially. It overlaps into sustainability, it overlaps into capacity, it overlaps into fundraising, federal grants, donations, planned giving. We're going to really tear that apart next week when we drill down on fundraising. But what I wanted to accomplish today is to be able to show you how you need to have internal mechanisms, internal people in place to be able to move into the next big realm of nonprofits. Otherwise, your nonprofit will go nowhere without these structures and without the potential for revenue, right? We can have all the hopes and dreams in the world, and our mission can be the best ever written. But if we don't generate revenue properly to be able to make our donations back to where our mission supports them and give our potential recipients the opportunity for tax write-offs and also to do it ourselves, we have to have the proper structure. Hope that makes sense. And that's where we're going with this. All right. So let's look at individual leadership now to finish up the program here, and talk about traits, qualities, skill sets that are recommended. They're not written in stone. Nothing's written in stone, but they're recommended. They're typical of highly successful organizations. So that's the point I want to make. So we'll start with our board of director, our chairperson, Eleanor Rigby. Does that name sound familiar? Okay, and her skill sets. Let's just look at Eleanor here for a second as our hypothetical leader of our board, right? She's got a lot of things working for her, a lot of assets, that she can share that makes her a wonderful candidate as chairperson for this organization and probably any nonprofit organization, because these are transferable skills. Oh, you know her, it's great. Let's all sing the song, right? It's a familiar song for those of us of a certain age. All right, vision and leadership, definitely. Got to see the big picture. But more than that, we got to be able to articulate the big picture, right? Okay, so we need Eleanor's vision, her leadership skills, and then also we need her. She's the champion. She's the advocate of our organization, and she oozes that, right? Along with a whole bunch of stewardship, responsibility, and integrity. She knows she's got other people's monies and other people's destiny. Perhaps I'm using those words in a big way, but it is. She's going to change some lives with this nonprofit organization, and she knows that. She also has the knowledge. She's got some financial knowledge. She's not a CPA or an accountant. Maybe she is, but she's probably not a CPA or an accountant or an auditor. But she understands financial operations, right? She understands receivables and payables, and assets and liabilities, right? Not that she's going to go out and take the CPA exam, but she understands the flow. She has knowledge of the product. She has knowledge of the industry. She has knowledge of Native American culture, for example. She's perfect for the condition. She's also personal. She has a personal commitment, and she's personal commitment and diligent, and she's congenial. She can work with anybody. See, those are wonderful traits to have for anybody. For any organization. And this is the benchmark that we're going for, we're shooting for. Eleanor is the gold standard here that we want to have, not just in our leadership, but within all of our board members. This is what we're shooting for, right? These kind of traits, characteristics, trends, skill sets, vision and leadership, ability to see the big picture. Vision. Every board member needs to get on board with the vision. Not only understand it, but be able to articulate it the way that Eleanor does. Be able to spread the wealth, so to speak, if they have permission from the board. The vision is what the organization wants to see happen. The mission is the action plan to get you there. And they need to understand the difference and be able to articulate that. Leadership, I got just a couple examples here from different scenarios. Leadership's like a quarterback. Play calling during football games, engendering effective board leadership among board members requires training and investment, just on a different field of play. Quarterbacks are the same thing as Eleanor Rigby, right? They are the shot callers, they are the playmakers, but they also have a way of making their offensive line, aka their staff and other board members, look good, right? If the wide receiver is good and looks good, and the quarterback puts the ball in his or her hands, they all win, right? The receiver looks good, the quarterback looks good, right? So a good quarterback is like an orchestra conductor. to use a totally different scenario, understands all the positions, doesn't necessarily is the best player of the oboe or the violin or the cello or the timpani, but understands them, knows what they sound like. I was in the orchestra when I was a kid, elementary school, high school, or middle school, high school. And to this day, I can pick out, because of that training, I can pick out sounds in an orchestra that a lot of people can't. I can pick out the difference between an English horn and a clarinet and an oboe, and the difference between a piccolo and a flute, or a bassoon, and the different saxophones. I have a trained ear for years of listening to that, and maybe I'd make a good orchestra conductor. I understand. I know what the sounds like. I couldn't play the violin to save my life, but I know what it sounds like and the difference between a violin and a viola, right? Those kind of things. Same concept here. Good leadership is transferable. So it could be any scenario. We could, the latest things now, the big, everything is about the food channel. So at least it is in my house. So chefs, whether you're a sous chef, head chef, just watched an interesting show the other day with my wife about a chef selection at one of the most 5-star restaurant in London. And boy, the what they did to put those potential chefs through the ringer to find the particular chef that represented what they wanted in that 5-star restaurant. And they started with they started with hundreds. They brought on camera 20. And then they narrowed it down over 4 sessions to 3, and then eventually to 1. But what an ordeal, because that person would be given the key to the entire empire of that particular hotel/restaurant, which is 5-star. And same thing as you can see on the screen here, but now we're talking about a specific recipe oriented. The chef is making bread instead of a quarterback, instead of an orchestra constructor, instead of Eleanor Rigby. Now we've got a chef doing the very same thing. But the result, the process is the same, the product is different, but the results are the same, right? I mean, different products, but results should be successful. All right, advocacy and stewardship. Advocacy is doing everything on behalf of the organization, not just being a board member once a month on Tuesday evenings from 7 p.m. to 8:30 when you have your monthly meetings. A board member is kind of like in perpetuity. Once a board member, always a board member if they're in good acceptance, good, doing their job. You don't flip a switch, flip a switch. I'm a board member on the second Tuesday of the month in the evening. I flip it off when I leave. No, it doesn't work that way. You're always on call, so to speak, like doctors on call. Now, you're not saving lives, but, as the organization grows, you are helping the organization to get healthy and to stay healthy and to survive, right? So it's not a switch on and off. Advocacy, stewardship, integrity is lifelong. It's in perpetuity. Talked about stewardship. Talked about integrity, talked about knowledge, the Eleanor Rigby level of knowledge, way up there, right? That's what we're striving for. Personal commitment and diligence, willingness. This is what we're looking for. When we, hear the expression cut from the same cloth, we are looking for, which is a biblical application, by the way. Anyway, we're looking for people, right, that are of the same caliber, so to speak, think the same, not necessarily look the same, but or have the same background, but are looking for what's best for the organization. And that's the personal commitment and diligence, the willingness to take the necessary time and make the necessary effort to fulfill the responsibilities of a board member on behalf of the corporation, soon to be nonprofit, right? That's not going to change, hopefully. Our board members will not change their desire, their focus, their ambition as the organization matures and goes from incorporation to 501c3 charitable nonprofit. Hopefully you've set it up in a way that things will flow right? This is what we do now as we're getting ready for nonprofit. So it's not we're mitigating the risk, we're mitigating the discovery. I'm telling you now what to prepare for, set yourself up for success, to ease the transition. Personal commitment, we talked about that. More in personal commitment. I don't know what else I can say about personal commitment. We're collaboratively with staff. That is a functional dysfunctional thing. Remember the transition from hands-on to more of a governance position that becomes more critical as the organization grows. Something that a good board is aware of, that we're bringing people on, hopefully, in different staff capacities, even if you're starting tiny with a part-time bookkeeper, which a lot of nonprofits do. That's fine. You've got to start somewhere as the organization grows, and perhaps that position goes from part-time to full-time, and perhaps that position goes from bookkeeper to accountant to deputy director to executive director. Planned growth for your staff. That's also something you need to think about. Succession planning. That's the phrase I want to use. Succession planning for the board, succession planning for the staff. For a board, before I was with the Native Learning Center, set your Wayback Machine to 1989, and I started I didn't start, I've been working for quite a while, but in 1989, I started working for a construction trade organization outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, land of the Amish and Mennonites. There was a huge chapter there called the Keystone Chapter, and it had over 700 open shop, merit shop contractor members, which means non-union construction companies as members. And I was the vice president of education there, and it was a great experience. But everything that organization did, they called themselves an association, was by committee. And they were considerably older. They've been running for 50 years by the time I got there. But they got to a point, everything was run by committee, and maybe this is in your short or mid or maybe even long-term future. Transitioning to a committee structure, it's in your bylaws, right? Where people, if they want to be involved in the organization, they must start at a committee level, as a regular committee person. Then the next step up is committee chair, and depending upon what the committee is, there might be two chairs, vice chair and first chair. Vice or chair, like that. First, you become a committee member, then a vice chair, then a chair of the committee. Then from there, after serving 2 years in that capacity, then and only then could they petition to be a board member. And they had to have a sponsor, a current board member that says, yeah, this person's been on that committee for 5 years, 3 years as a regular committee member, 2 years in leadership there at a committee level. And now they want to petition to become as a board director at large. Okay. And me being a board member, I'm endorsing that. You got to have a sponsor. And that would bring them onto the board at the lowest board level, member at large. And in that capacity, they had to be a member at large. If they wanted to pursue officer status, they had to be a member at large at least 2 years before they could even try to move to the next level. And then there was a tier from there. And then it went secretary, and then treasurer, and then vice chair. Okay. And then, for two vice chairs, second vice chair, first vice chair. This was the big organization. And then chair, right? And then ex officio after that. Now, that was a very mature nonprofit, aka association, 50 years under the, water under the bridge. Everything they did was by committee structure. The only reason I'm saying this is it was a farm team. It was a development process for bringing people onto the board without the guesswork. Now, they could do it. It took them years to get there. But you see where I'm coming from? A lot of what board or nonprofits struggle with is people being assigned to them, perhaps by tribal council that they don't know, or random people wanting to be board members, and the board is desperate and they say yes, and it turns out to be a disaster because they don't know the person. We want to try to set ourselves up for success here and have some kind of protocol in place in your bylaws that allows you to observe people before you say, come on to the board and make decisions that are going to change this whole organization, right? You want to do the best you can do without breaking any laws or ethics to get an idea of who these people are before they step in and start making decisions on behalf of the body, behalf of the board. I hope you follow me on that. You've got to think that through. You've got to think it through. How are you going? You want to recruit good people, right? You want to move from the initial 3 board members to the, move up in 2s to 5, maybe to 7, or eventually to 9, so that you can have some division and you work through some things and get different opinions, which is all good if you can manage it. It's all about managed growth. It's all about being methodical. I can't stress it anymore, having been involved in so many nonprofits on both sides of the equation, both as a board member and a staff member. I've seen them fail, burn down in fire, and I've seen others success, ultimate success, because they managed the process from the get-go properly, and they enforced it, and they did a good job with it. They knew what the risks were, and that's what we're trying to do here. So next week we'll start talking. I only have a minute or 2 left, right? About 10 or 15 minutes to wrap some things up here, get some points across, and kind of set the stage for next week, which I hope you'll join me as we move next week into fundraising issues, revenue generation, plan giving, donations, contributions, tax write-offs, all of those, and where the nonprofit can solicit contributions that they can take tax advantages of, and when can they start making donations to recipients that are equally tax write-offable, if that's a word, for them. It takes, that is an art and a science all itself. So we'll talk about that before the 4th version, which is by the time we get through next week, we should understand the dynamics that are needed to apply for nonprofit properly and to protect your program efficiently and effectively, so that you're setting yourself up for success. That's what I want for you most, and be able to set yourself up for success if you are indeed going to move towards becoming a nonprofit, or you are a small nonprofit already. These are good things to know. It's not too late. Even if you have 501c3 status, folks, it's not too late to implement these concerns into your bylaws, into your operation. You can always change things. May not be easy, but you can always. I didn't ever say it was going to be easy, but it's doable, and we can talk through it. So again, if you have any questions on some of these things that we talked about, please, actually, I think that's it for here. So if you have any questions or concerns about what we talked about today, you can see in the bottom left there, we talked about operating versus governance. We talked about building effectiveness of your operation internally specifically with your board of directors. We talked about function and dysfunction. We talked about organizational traits. We talked a lot about Eleanor Rigby and being the benchmark of operational traits and personality traits that we need to strive for in our leadership. And we talked specifically about leadership traits. So we did that today. Last week we talked about your startup processes. Next week we get into the money issue. Not so much, we're not going to talk about balance sheets and receivables and payables. I'm not going to tell you how to become a bookkeeper or an accountant or a financial planner. We're talking about the bigger issue here, and that is setting yourself up for revenue streams, traditional and what I call non-traditional revenue streams. So for 2 reasons. One, so that you meet the criteria of the IRS 501c3 process. And secondly, that you literally set yourself up for success, for cash flow, and because that is the lifeblood of any organization, whether you're nonprofit or for-profit, and that's cash flow, right? So we want to set ourselves up so that you have options as a nonprofit to pursue, whether they're federal grants, state grants, private industry, corporation, foundations, Native-centric community organizations like Shakopee Foundation that gives millions of dollars to tribal nonprofits. I'll talk about that next week. And then the bottom one says soliciting donations, planned giving. Donations of homes, cars, trucks, insurance policies, annuities, things like that. Big picture stuff. And then go through that. And then next week, the following week, we should be ready to talk about the process, the dreaded process of applying, but we're going to streamline it. Okay, 501c3 versus 501c1 encountered an organization. I'm not familiar with the C1s. We're talking about the C3s as opposed to a C6 and a C9. The C3 is the most common nonprofit classifications for charitable organizations, and it's also the most commonly recognized in the philanthropic community. 501c3, technically charitable 501c3 organization. Okay. Yeah, email. Yeah, and when we get into that, that's really part 4 to talk about the difference in the different 501 classifications. We'll go through it, and we'll talk about the difference between being a church, being an institution of higher learning, being a community foundation, being a bank, well, bank doesn't qualify, they're for-profit, but all those other organizations are different IRS classifications, and I'll define them for you. That's part 4. We'll get in, so you understand why am I pursuing a 501c3 and what does that actually mean in the IRS world of different nonprofit classifications. I'll explain that and why you don't want to be a foundation as opposed to a 501c3 charitable. The tax implementations are horrific for C6s. That's what a foundation is, and you don't want to go there if you don't have to. I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I'll save that. We're done here. I'm going to hang around. Our small nonprofit is a tribal government at the IRS level on paper. Yeah, probably a 7871, as they refer to it. 7871, Robert, maybe you know this, is a tribal nonprofit. IRS recognizes it as a nonprofit, basically with the same benefits as a 501c3. Oh, good. You're the EIN from the IRS. Okay, cool. The 7871 is a classification of nonprofit. It's exclusively for tribal entities. And there's nothing wrong with it. The only downside, if there is one, it's just not recognized in the philanthropic community at the same level that 501c3 are. That's all. It's just not as recognized. Oh, there is a quiz here. If you want to do it. Finishing up. Did I put the answer up there? Probably. What are the 3 duties of a board member? Care, ethics, and justice. A. B. Prudent prosecution and penalty. Well, that's great. C. Nepotism, peaceful demonstration, and equal pay. D. Care, loyalty, and obedience. Or E. Truth, more truth, and nothing but the truth. Well, of course it's D. Care, loyalty, and obedience. Not prudence, prosecution, and penalty. Although I like that one. That's not it. So, okay, that should really take us to the absolute end. And with the 5 or 6 minutes remaining, I'm going to turn it back over to Awista to close up. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to mute myself, but I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box in case any other questions come up. And if you want to talk about it some more next week, join me. And I'm gonna stop talking now. Okay, back to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Vince. You did an amazing job. It was a wonderful webinar. And for all our participants, if you agreed, please let us know how you feel about the webinar by filling out the survey. Every little bit of information helps Vince prepare for his next webinar and knows for the future what you would like to see, what he can include or take out, what he could explain more or not explain as much. Just please let us know what you like. That is greatly appreciated. Our next webinar is going to be with Vince once again. It's going to be August 15th, Fundamentals of Developing a Tribal Nonprofit Part 3. As always, registration is free. It will be at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Pacific, and 10 a.m. Alaska. As always, you can access this recording and all of our other recordings on our website under the Kadida tab. You can access any of our recordings for up to 2 years. If you have any questions regarding the recordings, please feel free to email myself or Brooke. Check out our upcoming events as well on our social media sites such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. We have a podcast titled Hope A Thing, a Native American Podcast. You can find that on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube, and you can watch the podcast on there as well. As always, thank you everybody for joining us today. We greatly appreciate you and hope you enjoy the webinar. Thank you once again, Vince.